Hutus. Even in mild-mannered Britain, the more committed socialists and Tories often seem to hate each other as well as what they stand for. And those gearing themselves up this week for the political showdown over fox hunting talk of their powerful antipathies in atavistic terms. We may be hardwired for hatred, evolved that way, an instinctive revulsion against those seen as other that was once necessary for survival. These days, though, we try to legislate it out of existence or adopt codes of political correctness to shame ourselves out of it. The Radio 4 series, Why People Hate, that's just finished, has shown what an uphill struggle, if not hopeless task, that'll be even for our multicultural and supposedly sexually tolerant society. Anyway, is hatred always such a bad thing? Can it sometimes be justified? Can it sometimes be legitimate? Our moral maze this evening. Most of our regular panel, Janet Daly of The Telegraph, restored to us this week, Dr David Cook, the medical ethicist from Oxford, the academic and journalist, Professor Ian Hargreaves, and in place of the historian some people love to hate, David Starkey, who's on a date with Queen Elizabeth tonight, we have Sean, that's the first, of course, we have Sean Gabb, editor of Free Life from the Libertarian Alliance. Ian Hargreaves, what's the central question in this for you?
Well, by my definition, human hatred is that state of mind in which another's humanity is denied, and you can't outlaw states of mind. But we do need to ask, how can we avoid inciting each other to hatred? How do we shame ourselves out of it, to use your phrase?
Janet Daly?
Well, two questions, really. In a free society, should we be making political decisions about what people have a right to think or to feel, as opposed to how they can act? And isn't it the case that negative emotions like resentment and envy and even hatred itself can produce changes for the good? They can lead to self-improvement in individuals and to forceful opposition to what is wrong in society.
Sean Gabb.
Every doctrine of love and equality that's become supreme in this world has actually unleashed a flood of hatred and persecution. And what I'd like to know tonight is whether the doctrines of love, whether the doctrines of anti-hate that pass under the name of political correctness are something different, or whether it's just another twist in the same old spiral of hate masquerading as love or anti-hate.
David Cook.
Back in the 60s, I was working with the Black Panthers, and one of the leaders, Eldridge Cleaver, used to say that if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. But what exactly is the problem with hate? What's its nature, and what do we do about it?
Big questions. Our first witness is Anna Atkins, who's the columnist and agony aunt, and presented one of these Why People Hate programmes, Why People Hate Christians in that particular case. And is there any kind of hatred which you would regard as justifiable? Actually, more to the point, who or what do you hate?
Yes, let me answer both of those questions. Yes, I do think some hatred is justifiable. Hatred of evil, hatred of cruelty, hatred of wrong. It's interesting that the Bible uses hatred in a positive way often. Those who love the Lord hate evil. I think those kind of hatreds are not only justifiable but important.
They sound rather abstract.
Yes, they are abstract, and I think that's important. I don't think it's ever right to hate a person, because a person is not wholly evil. A person may do evil things, but no person is wholly evil and therefore worthy of hatred, I think.
David Cook.
Can you tell me whether you think hatred is actually about an attitude or is about feeling and emotion?
I think it both. The word hatred can mean either, and they're very distinct, and it's important to make that distinction. And when we use the word hatred to mean the sort of gut churning, the road rage, or any kind of rage, I think it's a negative thing that we've got to be very careful of.
But in what sense are we morally responsible for what we feel?
Oh, we are. And some feelings are wrong, and that kind of rage.
And how can you stop a feeling happening to you? How can you stop that kind of wave of road rage?
Self-control. How do you stop? I mean, Jesus said if you lust after a woman in your heart, you're committing adultery in your heart. Therefore, if that's wrong, it must be possible to control it. Otherwise, he wouldn't bother to tell us that.
So people who hate, then, are people who suffer from a lack of self-control?
Not necessarily.
So why do they hate, then?
Well, which sense of the word hate are you using there?
Well, we're talking either in the emotion or the attitude.
Well, but you see, it's important to make the distinction, because the attitude may be right. It's right to hate in that sort of rational way, to say, I hate cruelty, I'm going to do my best to do away with it. But to hate in the atavistic way means that we've got to get a grip on ourselves and say, is this justifiable?
Right, but presumably as Christians we might think there are certain things that ought to be hated. We might think that genital mutilation or child abuse or murder. In a tolerant society where people take different views, how do we avoid lurching into a rejection, a hatred of people who uphold those views?
Somebody who takes a different view from mine about hating child molestation, I'm afraid if he carries it to extremes, must go to prison.
If only if they carry it to extremes.
Well, if he then puts it into practice, yes, he must go to prison.
Sean Gabb?
Love the sinner, hate the sin. Sounds good, but doesn't it to some extent dehumanise people if you refuse to hate them? And doesn't it also rather dehumanise you? After all, if you are incapable of hating, surely you're incapable of loving as well.
But you just, with due respect, contradicted yourself. If you hate the sin, you're not incapable of hating. You're just refusing to hate the whole person for the reason that I was suggesting earlier. It's perfectly possible to hate the sin. And I mean, when your child does something wrong, you hate the wrong that your child has done, but you don't hate your child.
Well, children are a rather different matter, but surely...
Or when anybody does something wrong.
But surely you would hate someone like Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin or Nicolae Ceausescu. These people were evil.
No, with due respect, they're not evil through and through. I know that's hard for us to come to terms with, but Adolf Hitler was created good.
Well, he liked good music, but he was not a good man.
Then neither are you. You know, we're all in the same boat. We're all created good. We're all sinners. Some sin we think more than others, but from God's point of view, we're all in the same boat here.
From a theological point of view, he chose evil.
But do you not choose evil ever?
Yes, but not.
Well, then what's
scale.
The difference? Yes, it's just a question of scale.
Janet Daly?
And you have your own views, obviously, on morally condemning certain kinds of hatred. But I suppose, when it gets into the public domain, we're talking about prohibiting certain kinds of hatred. Not the way people act, but the way that people feel. Do you think that it follows from saying that certain kinds of hatred are immoral to saying they ought to be legally prohibited?
Absolutely not, and I think you made that point very clearly at the beginning. We can't legislate against what people do in their hearts. We can only legislate against them putting that into practice.
But you would say, presumably, that in your own, religious teaching, presumably what you teach your children and so on, that you are trying to prohibit hatred in them. You're trying to say it's wrong to hate.
That's not the same as making a law about it.
No, quite. But I'm saying that isn't it even dangerous to suggest that people that they ought to be condemned for not suppressing their own inclinations to feel?
But are you talking about bringing out your children or making up laws?
I'm talking about a distinction between feeling and acting.
Right. When you're drawing up the laws of the land, you legislate against action. It's very, very dangerous to legislate against what I think is in your heart, because I don't know, and that's between you and God. But when you're bringing up your children, you're doing much, much more than that.
So you would actually want to say to your children, you must suppress any inclination toward hatred in your own heart.
I would say you're making it sound very sort of, you're skewing it a certain way to make it sound very repressive. No, you say to no, it isn't. You say to your children, look, if you feel like you hate that boy who is bullying you at school, it's important as a child that you express that and you tell me about it, and you come home and tell me about it, and then together we'll try and work out how you're going to handle that. It's not a good thing to feel. It doesn't make you feel good to hate.
No, but it might cause you to do something about it. Suppose you hated the child who was bullying another child, and that caused you to do something about it. If you suppress all your negative feelings, you're not likely to act on them in constructive ways. It might be constructive to act.
No, but then we're going... with a child, you're teaching the child to mature to the stage where he does hate the sin, but not the sinner. That's what you're trying to teach a child to do. Now, when you're only 5, it's difficult to make that distinction. But I hope when he's 25, he has made that distinction and he's able to use the hatred of the sin for social good. But he shouldn't hate the sinner.
Ian Hargreaves?
Isn't this biblical proposition, hate the sin, love the sinner...
I'm sorry, I don't think that's from the Bible, though, is it?
Itself, it's a summary of a position, isn't it? Itself problematic, because if you use the idea of hating somebody else's way of looking at the world, as Christians for generations were taught to hate Islam, for example, doesn't it very quickly shade over into permission for hideous acts of violence? Because hatred is being, if you encourage hatred even as an abstract, and the best intentioned organisations like the church have done it.
Yes, I think hating Islam, I don't know anybody who would encourage that today. I think that is quite an ugly thing. But take something like adultery. If you like, put myself on the line here, I hate adultery. I think it is very wrong. It's totally contrary to the way God has created us to be. It is very destructive of children's lives. But half my friends are adulterers. I don't hate them.
But in taking the position that you take, you are... I mean, if you take such a strong view about adultery, don't you have to act on it in some way, other than in your own personal behaviour?
Absolutely not. I don't act on it at all. I don't think adultery should be recriminalised. I think it's always wrong.
You don't think you should shun your friends or shame them into
totally ridiculous.
better behaviour?
Silly.
Or write in your newspaper column?
What force does your moral disapproval have, Anne, then? What force does it have?
On that one, it has a very strong force in my own life. And in the way I bring up my children.
You wouldn't commit adultery, presumably. But if you don't even chastise the friends who are committing this heinous sin, I mean, what force does your own moral conviction have?
Well, as I say, it has a very strong force in my own life. But it would be totally inappropriate, that particular one, totally inappropriate to go up to my friend and say, I don't think you should be doing that. If my friend came to me...
for everybody.
It sounds like moral cowardice, Anne. I'm sorry to tell you.
It is for everybody, but there are more important things than adultery.
Like social acceptance?
No, like hating God.
Anne Atkinson, sorry to cut you off in your flow there. Thanks very much indeed. Our next witness is John Torode, who's a columnist and editorial writer on the Daily Mail. John, can society's attempts to suppress hatred through, if you like, the fashion for political correctness ever be counterproductive, do you think?
I'm sure that it can be very counterproductive indeed. And in the most obvious way, the more you try and create thought crimes, the more you try and create a compensation culture, the more you are going to breed resentment. And if I can continue, the most obvious case recently was the lady of Turkish origins, the policewoman who received £10 million compensation for quite despicable racist abuse and persecution in the Metropolitan Police Force. Nonetheless, £1 million is not a bad piece of compensation for that when one considers how much a policeman who loses an arm, a leg, or whatever, an eye, or whatever it may be, how much compensation such a person gets. When one considers how much compensation physical victims of the IRA receive. I mean, the thing becomes utterly ludicrous and breeds resentment.
Ian Hargreaves, your witness.
Well, perhaps we'll come to the branding of women police officers, as used to be the case, on their breasts. But let's begin, but you think not really worth all that much compensation?
Not worth 10, 20, 100 times more than the compensation paid to somebody who loses an arm and leg, a couple of eyes, or something of that nature.
The £1 million is itself a bit questionable, isn't it? Even your own newspaper manages to remind us today that it's actually a sum of £215,000 and a pension, which may or may not add up to something resembling.
I would take a fair amount of racist abuse for that sort of money, but then I'm a fairly thick-skinned fellow.
Let's talk about racist abuse then. The word hatred doesn't appear much in English law. It appears a lot in, I probably share the view, too much in the American law. But it does appear in the act of incitement to racial hatred. Do you think that incitement to racial hatred should be a crime?
I think that incitement to racial violence should be a crime. I think incitement is a perfectly reasonable crime. What does it mean by incitement to racial hatred? I come and say, Ian, I've got some. No, I was going to say, but what on the earth does it mean? Well, do I come to you and say, Ian, I've got some jolly good reasons for not liking Serbo-Croatians, and I'm going to try and incite you not to like Serbo-Croatians?
No, that would be a private act, wouldn't it? But if you went and daubed on a wall, all niggers should be gassed, then I would call that incitement to racial hatred. Would you?
No, because I would call it pretty ineffectual incitement to racial hatred, because I don't think it's a very powerful argument, frankly.
Suppose it's a section
I don't think it's a very powerful argument.
Suppose it's a section of a football crowd where black players are playing and they're chanting, all black footballers should be gassed.
Then I think you're coming dangerously close to inciting violence, and I don't think you should be allowed. I don't think you should be allowed.
But does the violence have to occur before it's a crime?
I don't think that the crime is the incitement of racial violence. It's the incitement of violence.
Well, if the violence hasn't occurred, how can one make a judgment about whether it will occur? Surely it's better to define with difficulty, these are not simple matters, but to try to define a condition, which I think we all know what we mean, where you are trying to wind somebody else up to a position of hatred.
Okay, now what I was saying was it is the winding up. It is not. I mean, you introduced the business. You turned this particular bit of the discussion onto matters of race. As far as I'm concerned, the immorality is the winding somebody else up to violence. If I said, let's go and hit David because he's very fat. Or
so if the fact that what I succeed in winding people up to do is to go and surround somebody's house and chant, some black people's house, and chant, all 200 of us, all niggers should be gassed. How about that? Does that get into the legislative canon in your book?
Yeah, I would have thought that's pretty unruly and probably unlawful behaviour. Whether or not you're chanting all niggers should be gassed or all fat people should be gassed, or whether you're chanting I don't like Terode because he's a sort of foul-mouthed, arrogant sod.
Far be it from me to comment on David Cook's weight or physical appearance. It's your turn.
I'm just wondering whether or not there is a necessity in a multicultural society to respect views which are actually hateful.
I think I think there is, but I think it cuts both ways.
So does that mean that if the other person doesn't fulfill their part of the bargain, then I'm not obliged to respect their view then?
Oh, look, I mean, it depends. I suppose it depends what one means by respect. I mean, by respect in this context, I meant have a right to express have a right to express views.
And to tolerate that.
And to tolerate, yes. I mean, there may be all sorts of... I don't particularly respect Scientology. I think it's batty.
But you don't think society has an obligation, particularly, for example, in education, to protect our children as well as to protect vulnerable members of society?
To protect our children from what?
Well, from hateful views, from views which might lead them to a skewed understanding.
No, but hang on. What are hateful views? Are hateful views, for example, you've talked about education. Are hateful views the views which Clause 28 is supposedly protecting our children from, or are hateful views just the opposite of that?
Well, you give me a definition because you're the one who's concerned.
No, so you were the one who was talking about hateful view, protecting children from hateful views in education.
For example, female genital mutilation.
Right, yes, my view.
Child abuse is something.
Right, hang on. Let's stick with female genital mutilation. My view is very simple on that there are plenty of religious people, certainly Islamic subsects, who will tell you that genital mutilation is a jolly good idea. Let them say that if they so desire. If they start practicing it in this country, they should be in prison for a jolly long time. If they really want to live in the sort of society where female genitals are mutilated, they can pack themselves off to Sudan or somewhere and enjoy themselves.
In Hargreaves?
With no place here.
John, I'd just like to come back to, I suppose, race, but outside the law. How do you defend the first paragraph of a story in your newspaper this morning?
It's not my newspaper.
It's the kind of life many of the locals could only dream of. This is asylum seekers living on £30 a week in food vouchers. Is that calculated to present a fair view of that situation to readers of the Daily Mail?
I have not it is not my newspaper, it is not my story, and I just don't have any views on that. I'm not here to defend or to criticise the Daily Mail. So could we move on?
Fair enough. John Terode, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Our next witness is Professor David Starkey, the Jewish historian, of course. David, is the attempt to suppress hatred through political correctness a good thing, do you think? I mean, let's ask you a slightly more difficult and different question. If what we now call political correctness had been the intellectual fashion earlier in the century, do you think it would have prevented some of the awful things that have happened?
Well, let's just think about that for a moment with some concrete examples in mind, like the Oberammergau Passion plays, like The Merchant of Venice or Othello. Now, these plays have been a conduit for hatred through the centuries. They have incited people to hate. They have justified hatred. Great culture, or the church, has given its imprimatur to base feelings of hatred. And I think that perhaps if what have been called here today the thought police had come along and gone over the Oberammergau plays, the Passion plays, Merchant of Venice, you might have had something that was poorer literature, but might not have been such a force for evil, because that's what they have been. They have created, constructed, perpetuated stereotypes that have ultimately contributed to dehumanizing people.
It rather begs the question, do you think then the suppression of The Merchant of Venice would be a desirable, justifiable thing?
I don't think it would have had to have been suppressed, perhaps edited. Perhaps it could have been sent back to William Shakespeare and he could have been asked to, tidy it up, change it. Why do you need that particular kind of hatred? You see, to hate someone because of their skin colour, because of their blood, because of things that are unchangeable, supposedly essential, is to hate the person. It can only result in their annihilation. That's quite different from hating an idea, a regime, an ideology, which can be challenged and contested.
Sean Gabb, your witness.
Professor Cesarani, do you believe in freedom of speech for anti-Semites and other racists?
I do not believe in the freedom to incite racial hatred, no.
Would you allow someone to publish a book arguing very passionately that Jews do indeed commit ritual murder?
Absolutely not. I think
Very
that
well.
kind of book should be suppressed and banned.
Do you believe that racists should have freedom of association? Should people be able to exclude Jews and black people from clubs and theatres if they so wish?
I think that the present law on racial discrimination deals with that perfectly adequately.
Do you think the security services should be allowed, as the government is considering at the moment, to spy on and to disrupt meetings and the events of the British National Party and other racist organisations?
Well, I think there's a difference between spying on and disrupting, and I'm not quite sure that this government is planning to disrupt such meetings.
Should known members of the BNP have their telephones tapped?
A lot of things in this country, as in other countries, which are relatively harmless and innocent, are prevented. I watched miners in the Great Miners' Strike trying to go and join pickets where other miners and trades unionists were defending their rights. Now, if government is going to pass laws to prevent people from exercising their right to strike, I think it's rather rich to suddenly get aerated about the rights of people to incite racial violence.
Striking.
To incite the kind of behaviour that results in Stephen Lawrence lying on the pavement bleeding to death.
Do you think that known racists should be denied jobs in the public sector?
I think it depends what kind of public sector work they're going into. I think to have a racist as a teacher is a very severe liability. I think that probably, yes, someone like that is not fit to teach.
So what you want to do is to rip apart the whole fabric of liberal civilization as we know it in this country on some spurious grounds of
I think
respect
that's
for
the
other
slippery
people's
slope
rights.
argument taken to its absurdity. I don't think removing one or two racist teachers is going to rip apart the fabric of society. What you're actually doing are defending the values which enables a liberal, tolerant, multicultural, diverse
And once
society
you've
like ours
established
to
that
operate.
precedent,
But Professor
Janet
Cesarani,
Bailey.
you don't want to just condemn a handful of racist teachers. You want to rewrite the history of Western literature and civilization, apparently. You would prefer, you must be aware that by saying that you want The Merchant of Venice
Janet,
and
where have you
Othello
been?
re-edited, hang on,
Where have you
you've
been?
given them
It's
the
happened.
worst possible hostage to fortune to those people who regard political correctness as absurd.
It's happened. The
What?
great canon, Western Civ, has been deconstructed.
Yes.
Exposed as a cultural construct
And
that
you-
supported imperialism, colonialism,
Oh, my
and
goodness.
racism.
So you
now,
actually-
that does not mean you cannot read and, in a certain sense, enjoy Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, or The Merchant of
Oh,
Venice.
thank you.
But
So we'd be
we are
permissive.
now a lot wiser and more knowing about where these works came from and, yes, the
Oh.
pernicious effect they have had.
No, really. You're saying that we have your permission to go back and read these unacceptable works of literature.
No, you don't need my permission.
No, exactly. We certainly don't. No, but do we need anybody's permission? Would you prefer... What you're suggesting is extraordinarily authoritarian. You're suggesting that our present intellectual fashion, our present liberal consensus about what is acceptable and not, should determine post facto
But you
what is
see, the liberal
acceptable in the
consensus-
canon of
The
literature.
liberal consensus looks very different if you belong to a minority group, an ethnic
I belong
faith
to the
group.
same
that,
minority
thanks
group
to
that you
those
do.
Janet,
laws,
let him finish.
defending freedom of speech has been the object of racism, denigration,
Right.
contempt, not just for years, but for centuries, whose person has been so denied and besmirched that they can be assaulted
Yes.
and murdered with a sense
All right,
of impunity.
Professor Cesarani, I belong to the same minority group that you do, as it happens, and it would never occur to me to want to censor The Merchant of Venice. But can I put it to you that it's not speech, and it's not even inflammatory speech, that leads to genocide, or that led to the Holocaust. What led to that was totalitarian government. It was lack of freedom. It was not the misuse of freedom.
But Janet, again, I have to, dispute your facts there. Germany was under the Third Reich operated by consent and consensus. Hitler was incredibly popular. People did what he wanted to be done because they more or less agreed with him.
well-
And Hitler did not say to the voters, please come along, let's do something about the Jews. He ranted, he inspired hate, he directed hate, manipulated, and most appallingly, many cool, rational people around him, like Albert Speer, were
Yes.
willing to go along with
But
that.
are you
and
suggesting
that is
that...
hateful.
Of course it's hateful, and it's immoral. But are you suggesting that because of that incident in 20th century history, we should rewrite or find unacceptable the canon of historical literature, which predates any knowledge of such a crime, of such genocide? Or... Let him answer.
And the short answer is not necessarily rewrite it, but to deconstruct it, to critique it, to make people aware of where it's coming from.
David Cook.
I'm just interested that if I'd been in Hitler's Nazi Germany, political correctness would have meant that I would have thought it was all right to exterminate Jews. What makes your political correctness so good and Hitler's so wrong? I mean, aren't we just comparing political correctnesses here?
Well, I think that is a
The short
valid
answer
point.
is he's not going around murdering millions of people, isn't it?
Well,
And
but what's the basis of
when
value?
the
One
consensus when the consensus slips in that radical and terrible way, anything can become justifiable by an appeal to common sense and consensus. However, that happens usually in very extreme cases. And let's remember, the Nazis never gained a total majority of the
what's
vote
the
in
moral
Germany. And not
ground
everyone who
then
voted for
behind
them
that?
was an anti-Semite, racist, anti-Bolshevik bigot. They got votes for lots of different reasons. I think that you have to rely on common sense. I don't think that hate is natural. I don't think we're wired to hate.
So
I
where
think
does
on the
the hate come
contrary,
from then?
we're wired to feel compassion. I think many people do feel anger and resentment. And in societies that are unequal, inequalities of wealth and power, resentment, jealousy builds up. It is politicians and leaders who harness that, who turn that
And is
against
hatred
other
never
people.
ever justified? Or there are some things we ought to hate?
I certainly do think that things should be hated, and you may have picked that up from what I said at the very beginning.
Yeah, I
hate
think we got that.
injustice,
So it's all right
intolerance,
to hate.
tyranny.
We got that drift. Hang on a second,
It's all
Janet.
right to hate as long
Janet,
as it's
hang
the
on.
people you approve of us hating.
No, I think you can hate ideas, regimes, causes, effects, not people, not individuals.
Anna
Ian
Atkins told Sean that he mustn't hate Adolf Hitler. Do you?
Do I hate Adolf Hitler?
Would you have?
With a
Have you been-
vengeance, with a passion, and not just him, but Pol Pot
Is
and
he,
any
is he,
number
is he
of
not a human being? You
tyrants.
just said you couldn't hate or you wouldn't recommend, advise or morally defend the hatred of a human being.
You may have got me snookered there, but I'm prepared to contradict myself for the sake of saying, yes, I hate Adolf Hitler and all those like him.
So doesn't that undermine your whole-
Cesarani, thanks very much indeed. Not often anybody admits to being snookered on this programme, though a lot of people have been. Our last witness is Andrew Samuels, who's Professor of Analytical Psychology at Essex University, a psychotherapist, made a special study of the connection between emotions and social issues. Andrew Samuels, Professor Cesarani there said hatred wasn't natural. Is it natural?
Oh, it's certainly very widespread. I don't know about natural.
Well, it's not quite the same thing, is it? Hardwired was the nice glib way of putting it.
You know, if hatred is hardwired, then some of the things connected with hatred are probably hardwired as well, like the capacity to forgive, like the capacity to change. I think if you have a hardwired perspective, you have to include some of the more positive-sounding things in there as well. The psychoanalyst Winnicott said children are simply not born amoral, and I think there's a lot of evidence that babies are really quite moral people.
At what point do you think does hatred lap over into what we might define as mental illness, rather loosely?
Well, as I say, something very widespread is very difficult to claim as a mental illness, but if there's a kind of perverse pleasure in the act of hating and in the expression of hatred, if it's gone on for a very long time without anything shifting very much, if it's, if you like, stuck in a groove, if there's only one style of hating that seems to be on in any particular situation, I think you're getting close to something that is pretty much in the area of mental illness, yes.
Janet Dane?
There's a dangerous precedent in defining other people's hatreds or resentments as mental disorder, isn't there? I mean, Stalin was very fond of defining people as mentally disordered when he disapproved of their resentments or their hatreds.
I was quite careful to delineate, the sort of things that would take hatred away from the core of quite unobjectionable aggression that is always there, actually.
Yes.
I mean, that's what I've been hearing, sitting out there, listening to the various witnesses. It's quite clear that in most, should we call them hatred scenarios, there is a core of aggression that, as far as the person or persons feeling that aggression are concerned, is absolutely justifiable. And I think if you start off by saying that person, the other person's hatred, has no place, is unjustifiable, then I think you're doing something rather hating back, don't you?
Mm-hmm. And isn't aggression sometimes constructive? Sometimes we can feel aggressively envious and it makes us self-improving and ambitious, and sometimes we can feel aggressively resentful and it causes us to change things in society that perhaps ought to be changed.
Yes, on the personal level, in relationships and in personal growth, sometimes you have to be aggressive.
And even politically and
you
socially.
you have to crack eggs and all that kind of thing.
Yes.
You really do. And certainly if you want to change things in society, there will be frictions and there will be a lot of aggression around, and lingering hatreds will definitely take place. It's not eradicable, is it?
No, but would you want to eradicate it?
I don't think so. Not from the personal point of view, no. I think...
so all hatred isn't pathological, is
No,
it?
certainly not. No, I mean, to me, there is a certain kind of pleasure that this is the subjective bit. This is the bit that everybody has to decide for themselves. Sometimes when you listen to a political person express hatred, you get a feeling that there's a pleasure there. They've got a kind of political hard-on, yes? It often is men, usually is men actually, who go in for these very, very direct expressions of hatred. Then I think your warning signals need to be chiming, don't you?
Well, warning signals in the sense that we wouldn't particularly want to follow a political leader who based his program on hatred. But on the other hand, a certain amount of aggression might be necessary to be effectual politically. Maybe that's why politicians are so inclined to be aggressive.
The funny thing is that one person's unwarranted hatred is another person's healthy self-assertion, and this is
That's
the
why we
difficult part.
can't limit it legally.
There are real problems with limiting it legally, although from a psychological point of view, attempts to do so are more interesting than I think some of you have made them sound in the last 30 minutes.
Sean Gabb?
Thank you. You say that certain kinds of hatred can be defined as mental illness, hatreds that are repetitious or are unwarranted or are excessive. But surely you could say the same about love, couldn't you? Certain kinds of love are mental illness on your reasoning.
Oh, no question. Erotomania is a well-known thing. I think that one of the words that Shrink's use is very useful here, and most people understand what it means just by hearing it, and this is the word called projection. It's when you stick bits of yourself that you don't like into another person or into another group. This is the psychological underlay of prejudice. When that's going on to an excessive degree, then something pathological is happening. I think to call it mental illness is problematic, but to call it pathological in the sense of something that one doesn't feel is wholesome is a reasonable word to use.
Well, people like me are frightened of people like you, because when you come out so glibly with all these definitions of mental illness, all we see is a man in a white coat leaning over someone tied down with a syringe in his hand. What would you say to that?
I think therapists are probably the most libertarian, tolerant, non-judgmental group of professionals imaginable. In fact, my main objection to my colleagues is that they don't take stands on moral issues. And listening to you, it's very clear to me that in a funny sort of way, you are a sort of therapist. You are very, very reluctant to judge anybody. And one of the things that therapists and other medical professionals, for example, have to learn to do sometimes is speak out in public.
Ian Hargreaves?
I can confirm to listeners that Professor Samuels is not wearing a white coat. What puzzles me about your argument is the way that you talk about hatred as to do with feelings and aggression, as if that properly describes it. Surely hatred is something more than that. It's a conclusion. It's a worked out summation of feeling and thought, which makes it something much more dangerous, doesn't it?
Yes, I think hatred is a provocation in two directions. You can talk about hatred as a provocation to violence, to an enactment of that hatred, and that would be the final step in the kind of series you're talking about: feeling, thought, action. But hatred is also a provocation to forgiveness, to reconciliation, to all kinds of imaginative social acts. Now, we know about this on the personal level. We really do know that you can resolve what looked like a murderous situation. Don't need a therapist to do it. Goodwill is enough, and luck.
But it's not the hatred that causes a reconciliation.
Oh, I think it's a provocation to it. If you like, what I'm asking you to do is to step just a tiny little bit back. I hope this isn't too abstract. And say to yourself, well, what is the purpose of hatred? What does it inspire us to do? Now, on the one hand, it does inspire us to act, to kill. On the other hand, it inspires us to think about resolving it, reconciling it, doing something in a more creative direction.
But in spite of this now rather benign or ambivalent view that you paint of hatred, you would be in favour of us going down a more American road and trying to define a wider range of hate crimes or thought crimes, as they're sometimes called.
I'm ambivalent about all of that. I'm ambivalent about the...
So what's the point we missed in the last 30 minutes? Quickly, because
well, I think the political correctness is a flawed attempt to put things right in society. And what I'm more interested in is not so much does it work in practice, but what is, if you like, the ethos of it? What is its aim? What is a society trying to do when it passes a law against inciting racial hatred? Is a very interesting question.
David Cook?
Can I just ask, if there is someone who is pathologically suffering from hatred, can therapy cure them?
Yes and no. It depends, as I say, as in personal relationships, on goodwill and on luck. One of the things therapy can get people to do, and if the jargon is too much, stop me and I'll say it in other language, it can get people to take back the projections, to actually own a little bit of what is theirs and take it away from other people. Now, I've done some...
And self-knowledge is the cure, then?
Well, I don't know about self-knowledge, because this works on a group level. Best of all, I've done some work in Jerusalem, working in a kind of reconciliatory way with Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis. And it's very, very interesting how often in those sorts of processes people actually realize that what they've been seeing in the other group is something that's quite problematic for their own group. And that happens a lot, that people do take back what ought to belong to them.
Janet, the last question.
Do you think that our obsession with political correctness now, the fashion for it, is something to do with a society that for one reason or another seems to be terrified of aggression, overly afraid of aggression?
I think that we live in a society where there are fantasies of controlling everything, and that is the negative or shadow side of the whole PC and the legislation that sounds like it's PC. Although, as the previous witness said, what is PC in a way you can mock, and what is PC in a way you're thankful for depends on who you are. And there are many people who I think have reason to be thankful for legislation in the social area. But I think there is a fantasy of social control around, and I do think it's not so much a dangerous fantasy as a doomed fantasy. If you like, we're suffering from an interplay or a debate between two groups of hopeless idealists. On the one hand, you have people who think that political correctness can never do anything. It's basically Stalinism in disguise. You people who think that are idealists and out of touch. On the other hand, there are people who think you really can change innate or not, or deep down racism and other prejudices in people. That's also hopelessly out of touch idealism. The middle ground has not been explored.
Wonderful. We leave that ringing in the air. Andrew Samuels, thanks very much indeed. Janet, at the beginning of all this, you, in fact, a couple of people said in the panel said, how can you possibly legislate about or even create pressures on what people think and feel?
Well, it's not only how can you possibly, it's a dangerously sinister and totalitarian idea. In a democratic society, the point of an enlightened democracy is to find ways of accommodating the truth about human experience, not to deny it or to suppress it.
Professor Cesarani seemed to think it would be possible to somehow expunge.
I'm afraid to say that I think he was dangerously wrong. That his views seem to me, on the one hand, naive and on the one hand, sinister. The idea of expunging resentment and hatred, not only does it seem to me out of touch with reality, but it also seems positively dangerous in that it would suppress and make illegal and prohibit such profoundly basic instincts in human nature that it would actually be counterproductive, that it would actually increase people's resentment.
Sean, you wondered at the beginning whether the doctrine of anti-hate, as you put political correctness, was merely just another twist, that we've seen it all before in different guises. Did what you hear lead you to a different conclusion?
Afraid not. If you look at the whole course of history, we live at the moment in a little bubble limited by space and time of rationality and benevolence. And if you attack the foundations of that, freedom of speech, freedom of association, a general tolerance, even of views you don't like, then you burst that bubble and we're straight back into the Middle Ages. And well, I think of the famous poem, but to twist it round slightly, first they came for the Nazis, but I wasn't a Nazi, so I said nothing. But who do they come for eventually?
David Cook, you asked whether we should respect views that were hateful at the beginning. Did you come to a conclusion? Well, you obviously started with a conclusion, but have you changed it?
No, I haven't changed it. I mean, I had some worrying things because I think that the law has to play a part here. There has to be some kind of moral law which draws distinctions between right and wrong, good and bad. And if people break the law, there has to be some kind of sanction. For a society to function, there has to be a way of protecting the vulnerable and making sure that our children and ourselves are properly protected.
And in doing that, Ian Hargreaves, did you find Anne Atkin's distinction between emotion and attitude in hatred a valid distinction?
I'm not sure I really understood what she meant by that. I mean, I even found problematic her distinction between the sin and the sinner, because I think that what the discussion this evening shows is that once you start to talk about wanting hatred because you believe it has some kind of value, aggression clearly does have value, but hatred is a moral evil when it is directed at another human being because it denies that other human being's humanity. Therefore, we must do everything that we can to restrain the forces of hatred, including using the law where the law can be effective.
And didn't we see the result of that with Cesarani, who, in the name of tolerance, the name of acceptance, actually showed how much he hated individuals, and the whole view collapsed?
Janet, you thought hatred could be a force for good, didn't you? Or you posed the question, and certainly Andrew Samuel seemed to chime in with that.
It can be a force for what you might call human progress. It can be a force for moving on, for doing a critique of the present. But I was interested in David Cook's remark about people having to be protected. People certainly do have to be protected in a civilized society, but they have to be protected from actions, not from words and thoughts. When you start protecting people from words and thoughts, you're halfway to totalitarianism.
Sean, is it as simple as that for you?
Yes, it is. I'm with John Torode. You do not persecute people for what they say, even if what they say is rather shocking.
Or objectionable.
What you do is you put them in prison if they start beating people up.
I thought John Torode was rather confused about that, wasn't he? He wasn't at all sure where we were going to draw the line with varying degrees of ever louder incitement to hatred as opposed to actual violence.
Drawing lines is difficult, but they must be drawn somewhere.
Yes, but it's not more difficult to define hatred than it is is to define incipient violence. These are both difficult things to define.
Interestingly, the United States, I've just come back from a trip to the United States, which is the home of political correctness. They have legislation against hate crimes, but they're absolutely shocked by our laws against racial incitement because it's to do with language. That is a contravention of the First Amendment, which guarantees them freedom of speech. They have no trouble making that distinction.
And you rather admire that particular attitude?
Well, yes, I do, actually. I think it's the right way around.
Well, that's it for this week. From our panel, Janet Daly, Ian Hargreaves, David Cook and Sean Gabb, and from me, until the same time next week, goodbye.
The Moral Maze was presented by Michael Burke and produced by David Coombs. After the news, we